The brass name card slid out of the seatback holder with a soft metal click, and Eleanor Hargrove turned it face down before the woman it belonged to could sit. "I always sit here," she said, loud enough for the first 2 rows of the first salon car to hear. She set her gloves on the window seat the way other people plant a flag. Camille Boudreaux stopped in the aisle. Her ticket was already scanned. Her small case was still in her hand. The window seat she had reserved 3 weeks earlier, on the night train they called the Cascade Crescent, had just had her name flipped out of sight. She did not raise her voice. She rarely did. The car was warm and gold-lit. All dark wood and low lamps. The kind of comfort that came with a price printed in fine letters. A porter moved a tray of glasses. Somewhere ahead, the engine breathed. Hannah Doyle, the care attendant, reached Eleanor first. She poured her water without being asked. She unfolded a napkin across the older woman's lap. She smiled and used her name. "Of course, Miss Hargrove." Then she looked at Camille, and her voice changed. "Coach is 2 cars back." "Ma'am, you sure you're in the right one?" Camille was 36. She wore a dark coat and flat shoes made for long platforms, no jewelry worth noticing. No entourage. Just a leather bag and the stillness of a woman who spent her days reading other people's records for a living. "My name was in that holder," she said. "You just turned it over." Hannah's smile held. "This is a courtesy reseating for one of our select premier guests. We use a little discretion with our regulars." 2 more passengers boarded behind Camille, a couple in pale travel clothes, and Hannah waved them to their seats without a single question. Camille noticed that she noticed most things. She set her case down slowly and looked at the seat that was hers. The brass card lay face down against the leather. On the small screen at the attendance station, a line was already forming under the seat number. Guest relocated, voluntary, Ali. Becoming a record. "I didn't ask to move," Camille said. Her words were short and even. "Log the reason somewhere I can read it." Hannah's hand tightened on her tablet. Across the aisle, an older man lowered his newspaper. Walt Kessler had spent 30 years settling labor disputes, and he knew the exact sound a fair process made. This did not make that sound. He watched the brass card lying face down, and he did not look away. Eleanor settled into the window seat and smoothed her coat. "I've taken this train for 12 years, she said. "To no one and to everyone. People know where I sit." That was when Camille saw it. Eleanor did not reach for cash. She did not open her purse. She tipped her head toward the young woman standing behind her, her assistant, and made a small motion with 2 fingers. The assistant, Kara Mott, looked down at her phone. Her thumb moved. A soft chime sounded. The unmistakable sound of a payment sent. Her face went pale, the way a face goes when a person does something they have already decided was wrong. Camille did not know what the message said. She did not need to. She knew a transaction had just happened, and transactions leave a trail. She let the moment settle into memory the way she filed everything. The time, the car number, the name stitched on the attendant's vest, the exact tilt of 2 fingers. She had built a career on the gap between what people said and what their records showed. That gap had just opened in front of her. Heavier footsteps came up the aisle. Roy Peterson, the chief conductor, arrived with the calm of a man who believed the train was his to command. He did not look at the brass card. He did not look at Camille's ticket. He looked at Camille first. That told her almost everything. "We need this car to keep moving," he said. "I'm going to ask you to take a seat back in coach." Eleanor folded her hands, satisfied. Hannah exhaled. The pale couple pretended to study the window. Camille placed her first-class ticket on the small table between them. Face up. Unhurried. Then she looked at the chief conductor, and her voice stayed soft and very clear. "Before I stand up," she said, "I'd like to know one thing. Who just paid for this seat?" The car went quiet. Roy's jaw moved. Half a second too slow. And in that half second, everyone in the first salon understood that the question had landed somewhere it was not supposed to reach. Roy Peterson recovered the way men like him always did. By changing the subject to rules. "Ma'am, I'm not going to debate this in front of the car," he said. "If you won't relocate, I'll have to place a passenger conduct hold on your account. That flags you for future premium booking. And it lets me put you off at the next station." He said it the way a man lays down a winning card. Camille did not flinch. She had heard worse sentences read in worse rooms. "A hold," she repeated, "for sitting in the seat I reserved. For disrupting service." Eleanor leaned toward him, playing her part with the ease of long practice. "She's making a scene. I simply asked for my usual seat." Her voice trembled at the edges. The trained tremble of a woman who had never once been the one removed. Hannah, cornered now, added her own brick to the wall. The guest agreed to the change. "It's a voluntary relocation." That was the second lie. And this one was in writing. Camille looked at the attendant's tablet. Then at Roy. "If the change was voluntary," she said, "there's a consent line in the car log with my agreement on it." "Show me that line." Roy's hand moved toward the tablet and stopped. There was no line. "And if it wasn't voluntary," she went on, still quiet, "then it was paid for. A payment leaves a record. A record doesn't erase itself because it's inconvenient." Walt Kessler folded his newspaper. "She's right about the log," he said. Not loud. Just certain. "I've watched the whole thing." The card was face down before she ever sat. There was nothing voluntary about it. Roy ignored him and reached for the service phone. He spoke a few low words toward the front of the train. Minutes later, a railroad police officer came up the aisle. Officer Quinn was unhurried, with the steady eyes of someone who read a file before touching a person. "I'm told there's a passenger refusing to move," Quinn said. Here was the moment the train expected to end the way these things usually ended. With the calm woman walked off into the cold. Camille turned to her instead. She did not raise her hands. She did not raise her voice. "Officer, before you remove anyone, you should know what you're standing in the middle of." She nodded toward Kara. "That young woman just sent a payment to this attendant, on instructions from the woman in my seat, to take that seat away from me. That's bribery of an employee. Whether I move isn't your question. Whether that money changed hands is—" Quinn paused. That was all Camille needed. That pause. The officer turned to Kara. "Is that true?" For a long second, Kara Mott said nothing. She was 28 years old, and she had spent 2 years telling herself that doing what Eleanor asked was just the job. Then she opened her phone with shaking fingers and turned the screen toward Quinn. There it was. A transfer. Eleanor's instruction, carried out by Kara's own account. The recipient's name matching the attendant's, and on the memo line, careless and damning. 2 small words. Window seat. Money never knew how to keep a secret. Eleanor's face changed at last, the satisfaction draining out of it. "That's a private matter," she said. "It stopped being private," Camille said, "the moment it bought a seat that wasn't for sale." Quinn looked at the screen, then at Roy, then at the brass card lying face down. She stepped back half a pace. The way a person steps back from a thing they had almost been part of. "I'm not removing anyone," she said quietly. "Not until I understand what this is." Camille did not celebrate. She did not pull out a phone to film. She did not ask the car to take her side. She did what she had done 100 times before. For a living. She opened her email and typed a short, cold message to the railway's program integrity line, the office that existed to catch loyalty fraud. The subject was 4 words. Staff bribery preserve ledger. She listed the car number, the train number, the time, and one instruction: freeze and preserve all loyalty transaction records before anyone could touch them. She pressed send. Walt Kessler was already writing too. In a small notebook, in the clean, ordered hand of a man who had recorded 1,000 disputes correctly. He would give a statement that no one could twist. A line appeared on Camille's screen. Automatic and final. Integrity case opened. Ledger frozen. Nothing had been won yet. No one had been punished. The train still rolled on through the dark, but a door had just opened inside the system. And this time it would not close. The case did not open in a courtroom. It opened in an office 200 miles away, where Gordon Stahl ran the railway's program integrity desk and spent his days watching for people who stole points, gamed upgrades, and gamed the system. By the time the Cascade Crescent was still rolling through the dark, the ledger was frozen on his screen, exactly as Camille had asked. He did not need to know who she was. That was the part Eleanor and Roy had never understood. The woman in the dark coat had not won because she turned out to be someone powerful. She had won because she forced the system to do the one thing it was built to do. Stahl pulled the transfer. Kara Mott's account on one side, Hannah Doyle's account on the other. A memo line with 2 small words on it. Bribery of an employee was not a service complaint. It was a real offense, and it did not care about anyone's status. Then he did the thing that mattered most. He did not reopen old paperwork or hunt for buried complaints. He simply searched the ledger for the same pattern, the same recipient account, the same kind of memo, paid by other passengers on other nights. The screen filled. Hannah Doyle had sold seats this way before. More than once. The truth had been sitting in the money the entire time, waiting for someone who knew where to look. The consequences did not arrive as a single dramatic firing. Eleanor Hargrove lost her Select Premier status permanently, the standing she had worn like a birthright for 12 years. Her file was forwarded for handling as commercial bribery. The clubs and circles that had always moved aside for her grew quiet in a different way now. The slow quiet of a name being set down and not picked back up. No one shouted at her. They simply stopped saving her a seat. Hannah Doyle lost the right to work the cars, but she was not made into a monster. In the small office where they took her statement, she put her face in her hands. I told myself everybody did things like that, she said. I told myself I needed the money. I was wrong. It was not an excuse. It was the first true thing she had said all night. Roy Peterson kept his job, but the railway stripped him of the one power he had reached for too easily. He could no longer place a conduct hold on a passenger. The authority he had used to threaten a woman in her own seat was the exact authority taken out of his hands, and the system corrected the gap that had let it all happen. The loophole that allowed one passenger to relocate, yift, or quietly buy a seat reserved in another person's name was closed across the whole line. From that night forward, a seat that carried someone's name could not be reassigned without that person's logged consent. The record would no longer take a lie just because someone confident handed it one. Camille asked for none of it as a prize. When the conduct hold on her own account was lifted, she did not frame it as victory. She did not demand that anyone be marched off the train to even the score. She had asked for 2 things only: that the trail be preserved and that the gap be closed. Both were done. Before his stop, Walt Kessler stood and buttoned his coat. He paused at her seat. reached down, and turned the brass name card right side up. Then he slid it gently back into the holder on the seatback, into the place it had been before any of this began. For a moment, Camille looked at her own name, sitting again inside its small frame of brass, lit gold by the low lamp. The train ran on toward morning. The window held the dark fields, and the first thin line of gray beyond them. She thought of the question the whole car had been built to ask. The question hidden under the napkins and the discretion and the 12 years of habit. Would they have done it if they had known who she was? The answer had never mattered. The point was that they should not have done it at all. Money always leaves a trail. Dignity should never have to ask for a seat. Camille sat down in the place that was hers. And this time no one asked whether she belonged. This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes.